Welcome to the Resilient Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Kachigian, and today I'm joined by Russ Roberts. Russ is interested in how the essential insights of economics can help us understand the world around us and lead better lives. He is a research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution and host of the weekly podcast Econ Talk, hour-long conversations with authors, economists, and business leaders. His latest book is How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life, an unexpected guide to human nature and happiness. It takes the lessons from Adam Smith's little-known masterpiece, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and applies them to modern life. He is also the author of 3 economic novels teaching economic lessons and ideas through fiction. A 3-time Teacher of the Year, Russ has taught at George Mason University, Washington University in St. Louis, the University of Rochester, Stanford University, and the University of California, Los Angeles. He earned his PhD from the University of Chicago and his undergraduate degree in economics from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I first encountered Russ's work when I stumbled across his article, What Do Economists Actually Know? It was refreshing to hear an economist like Russ talk about the limits of mathematical models, quantification, and the ability to predict important events. That article led me to Econ Talk, which has unquestionably influenced my thinking more than anything I encountered during my formal education. Econ Talk is ultimately about how to manage uncertainty, and its underlying theme is that we don't know nearly as much as we might think about complex domains like economics, medicine, ethics, and policy. Russ has written and spoken extensively about tribalism and the emotional comfort of being certain. Here, we discuss how online mediums incentivize us to pursue this emotional comfort at the expense of truth. We talk about how our manner of interacting online might change when information is overly abundant compared to when it is scarce. Attention and outrage are the currency of our time, and signaling that we are on the right side of a debate often yields unintended consequences, mainly creating a political climate that we claim to despise, but one that we are all complicit in perpetuating. Many tech ethics conversations focus on the platform, or top-down solutions, not the user or bottom-up solutions. While Russ and I do discuss the potential place for regulation in the current informational climate, this is mainly a conversation about how we, the consumers of information, can alter the incentives to steer us away from outrage. The conversation Russ and I have here is far from uplifting, but it is, I think, a necessary one. This podcast is brought to you by Resilient Performance Systems. If you enjoy the material here, please check out our website at www.resilientperformance.com and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on future podcast episodes, articles, and upcoming content, including training templates and live and online courses. The sign-up link for the newsletter is in the show notes. Podcast listeners will receive a discount on all paid content by entering the coupon code PODCAST. That's PODCAST in all capital letters. Additionally, please consider writing an iTunes review if you find these podcast conversations informative. They help us continue to attract high-quality guests. Here's Russ Roberts. Russ, thanks so much for taking the time to come on. So I know that you've written and spoken a great deal about tribalism and just how to embrace uncertainty and not be too sure of yourself. So we'll get right into kind of the heart of this here. To what degree do you think that social media platforms incentivize ideological extremism, and what consequences do you think that these social media platforms and the way that they incentivize extremism affect our ability to be informed consumers of information?
I'm going to back up a second. It's taken me a long time to come to the view I'm going to express. It's kind of depressing, and I didn't really want to believe it. But,
okay.
I've come to believe that we're not that interested in the truth as human beings. We sort of talk like we are, and I think if we're asked, do you think the truth's important? Of course the truth's important. So we certainly like the idea that the truth is important, but we don't always act that way. And one way that you can see that is through social media. And so to answer your question, I think it does incentivize not so much maybe extremism as overconfidence and maybe ideological blindness. You could call that a form of extremism, I guess. But the way I think about it is the information landscape has been transformed over the last couple of decades through technology. The first change was cable television, where it used to be you got 3 channels and they all had pretty similar news broadcasts, right? The top story was going to be similar. Uh, their perspectives were pretty similar. You didn't have a lot of choice if you wanted something outside that mainstream view. And cable TV comes along and it gives you a couple of things. One thing, it gives you a little more choice, a little more variety. You're going to start getting alternative cable news channels. They're also going to be running all day long, which means that they're going to be always looking for ways to grab your attention and keep you interested. And they're going to have more opportunity to do that. And then the internet comes along. And what the internet allows you to do is really tailor your information stream to the way you look at the world, and as opposed to finding out the truth. If you're interested in the truth, you'd consume an enormously wide variety of sources. And some people do, of course, because they're interested maybe not just in the truth, but in variety. But a lot of other folks seem to mainly just listen or watch or follow stuff that makes them feel good, which I get. It's like, the analogy I use is like my shoes. I want my shoes to be comfortable. I want them to be stylish. I want them to fit. And it's weird, but I think a lot of us treat the news the same way. I want it to be stylish. I want to believe what's in vogue or what's hip or what's cool. I want it to be comfortable. I don't want to be too jarred by what I watch or read. And I don't want it to be too expensive. I don't want to have a cost from that news that's going to bother me. And so I think a lot of people just get the news that makes them feel good, the way they buy the shoes that make them feel good. And I get that. That's great for shoes. It's not so good for news, though.
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways to go about this. There's kind of the more technical answer where if you talk to people who are familiar with how the algorithms work, I guess the algorithms sort of, perpetuate clicks and posts that get more likes, and the things that get more likes typically are the things that garner the most attention. And then there's kind of the more sort of qualitative answer, which is people like confirmation bias, they like to be part of a tribe, things that you've spoken about. And I have no way of definitively proving this. I'm purely speculating. And so maybe by virtue of the fact that I'm speculating, I'm part of the problem. But it just seems to me like a lot of people who, when they do these things and they say things online, it's not because, like you said, they're interested in the truth or spreading information. It's because they're signaling to people that they're sort of on the right side of a debate. And it could be kind of a benign debate, like which sports team they like, or it could be something more consequential that's related to a political policy or, an important current event. But you also talk a lot in your writing and your work about incentives. And it seems now that, attention is the currency of our time. The things that gain the most attention are incentivized. And that's typically saying outrageous things or saying things that deviate from the center to, get those clicks and get those algorithms working. But I also look at it as if you, for example, are tweeting or Facebook posting about a political candidate that you claim to hate 10 times a day, presumably you're also making that person or that ideology more relevant, because now you're incentivizing that algorithm to keep, highlighting that person or that idea. So do you think that perhaps despite this emotional need to be part of a tribe and to be right and to have confirmation bias, that there could actually be a downside to that sort of emotional way to spread information? Because throughout most of history, right, like information was scarce, it wasn't abundant. And now that it's abundant, perhaps the incentives have changed to the point that if we are talking about something that we don't like and we do it too much, perhaps we're actually empowering that very thing. So do you think that, a lot of times with these tech platforms and social media, it always focuses on like what the tech platform needs to do differently to sort of behave better, but we never talk about the more bottom-up emergent order type things, like how the user of these platforms can make the experience better for everybody. So do you think that our behavior should change when information is more abundant compared to when it's scarce because of the different incentives now with what technology and how that can, spread some of these ideas?
Well, there's a lot of different things there. Let's try to take them one at a time. First of all, because it's so abundant, it's much more competitive. So when you have 3 TV stations, they kind of have a good deal. Only 3 choices. So they're not going to literally divide the market up a third, but if they stay close to each other, they're not going to lose a lot of business. And so they're all surviving and doing fine when there's only 3 of them. It's kind of a good deal. When it gets more competitive and you have a lot more folks out there, all of a sudden you're at risk of dropping off the cliff and not being watched or clicked on or listened to or read. And so that's going to encourage you to be really focused on getting eyeballs. So a lot of what we see on news sites and other types of websites is things that are going to get clicks. And as you point out, some of those are not going to serve what you think is what you care about. There's a story out today that President Trump is in a feud with women's national soccer team player Megan Rapinoe about coming to the White House. Now, there's nothing of interest in that. There's nothing important about that dispute. It's the kind of dispute that gets magnified and amplified by people's online behavior. There's a natural urge to click on it to see what's going on. Why is the president in a feud with a women's soccer player? It was the front page story, I think, on Yahoo's sports page earlier today. And I almost clicked on it. And I thought, wait a minute. I'm not going to fall for this. That's for suckers. There's nothing there. You're right that sometimes outrage about either side of the political divide is going to generate a lot more attention. I think what's important to remember, and it's important because it's just not so obvious, is that what sells is outrage. It's not truth. So if someone says, take another sports example, Tom Brady said, Phil Simms earlier, or was it Chris Simms? I can't remember. A Simms commentator said Tom Brady's only the 9th or 19th, I don't know what he said, best quarterback in the NFL. Now, a lot of people think Tom Brady is the best quarterback in the NFL. Some people might think he's 4th or 3rd or 2nd or 5th. But whatever this commentator said, it was unusual, right? Now, it could be this is a deep insight. Maybe Tom Brady's overrated. Or it could be that this guy's a jerk and Tom Brady's actually great. That doesn't matter. The news site doesn't care. The fact that it's an outrageous opinion is going to generate two types of clicks. People who go, yeah, he's overrated. And the other group that goes, no, he's not. And that back and forth is what sells. And so there is a dynamic there of incentives that I think is extremely unhealthy. And then you ask the question, well, what's our responsibility? The answer is, well, we might have a particular responsibility not to click on certain claims like that. Or we might have a responsibility to be more truth-seeking than just excitement-seeking or confirmation of our viewpoint seeking. But the problem is there's no incentives to do that. So we need some kind of change in our cultural norms. I'll give you another example. I'm not very important, obviously, or important at all, but after a mass shooting, I don't use the name of the person who did the shooting in anything I tweet or write about it. I don't write about mass shootings much, but when I do, I try not to. I don't mention the person's name. In fact, I think you should say, coward guns down 11 defenseless people. And I think you should denigrate that person for their cowardice. Now, the media, there's some media sites that have started to do things like this. They don't always mention the shooter's name. They might mention it in the first story and then never again. And I think that's really a good practice, or not to mention it at all, because it incentivizes future killers who want attention. And I love the idea that we don't give them, it's a version of this is when the sports fan runs on the field. The cameras won't show it. They did the beginning, but now they just decided, yeah, this is stupid. Why give them, here's a person breaking the rules, ruining the experience for everyone else. We're not going to give them the satisfaction of publicity, not just for justice reasons, but we don't want other copycats to think this is going to work for them. So that norm has developed in certain settings. And similarly, someone puts up a video of something incredibly private, whether it's sexual or whether it's a violent act that, that's graphic and just degrading to watch. It's hard not to click on it. Like, people do like to watch supposedly car accidents. It takes some strength to say, this isn't good for me and it's not good for the world. I'm not going to do it. That's a tough norm. I'd like it to emerge. It might not, though. And our challenge, I think, is trying to figure out what's the socially responsible behavior in this current landscape, and then trying to see if we can encourage ourselves to live up to it. Not easy, right? When the incentives, when you're bored, you click on stuff that grabs your attention. To say to yourself, yeah, that's not good for me. That's kind of like the same challenge I have when I have the thing of ice cream in front of me. My natural tendency is to get a spoon out.
Yeah, and you talked about, the example of like the mass shooter, and I totally agree that we shouldn't be glorifying these people and naming them. Where, that's a clear case where yes, it like makes sense to shame that person, but it's not always that clear cut, right? Because there's examples.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago, there was a baseball fan. I forgot what stadium it was at, but it showed him basically like kind of reaching over a child to catch a foul ball. And
Yep, I remember that story.
it was a 5-second clip, so you didn't get to see what happened before or afterwards. Basically,
Yep.
if you looked at the clip, it was a guy grabbing a foul ball, reaching over a kid, and just for that split second, he kept it for himself. And I mean, like, the amount of like outrage and hate that was directed towards this guy, when apparently it emerged later on that he had like caught 20 foul balls and given a bunch of them to kids, and he was basically catching foul balls for the kids and giving it to them. So he had been doing good deeds all day, but you wouldn't have known that based on the initial reaction. So, like I said, I think that the shaming sort of makes sense when it's a very clear-cut case, but it's not always clear-cut. And a lot of these videos that we're seeing don't have all of the contextual elements to make an informed decision. So how do we go about even determining like when it's appropriate to exhibit? Outrage is a normal human emotion, right? I'm not saying that we need to be robots and not react emotionally, but how do we know where to draw the line? And I know that's almost an impossible question.
Well, it's a good example though, because there's so many things. The baseball story, the foul ball story. It turned out, assuming that the full video wasn't doctor photoshopped or whatever, that this person had been a good citizen all day long. And even the thing that looked bad at the time it wasn't like, I don't even think he took it from the kid then, or reached over the kid. It turned out, I think it just was misinterpreted on social media. So that's a video. But what about when you get a study, somebody quotes a study. So I got an email today from a stranger saying, there's a study on happiness that was done. It looks like, maybe the data wasn't right. And so I wrote the author, and the author wrote me back, and I don't understand the studies that this author is claiming are true, but the attitude seems weird. And so I spent a little bit of time looking into that, right? And it turned out that this person who wrote me was probably right. This scholar was not doing a great job in passing on the sources for the claims that the scholar was making. So most of us don't have time to do that. It was kind of my job, is to look and see whether studies are reliable and what's being overstated or what's being missed. But most of us, that's not your job. That's just a hobby at best. It's not even a hobby. It's you don't have time for any of that. You just read things and you have to decide, is this right or is it wrong? And the way we usually deal with that, of course, is, well, there's two ways I think we deal with it. I'll pick three. One way is we go, oh yeah, that must be right because it confirms what I already believe. The second possibility is, well, I don't know if that's right or not, but I trust that person who said it. And the third is, gee, this is probably really more complicated than can be conveyed in a tweet, and maybe I should just hold my judgment. And I think we're much more prone to the first two. Those are what I think most people do. And it's almost what you have to do in a complicated world, because it's really hard to know, like you say, from one 30-second clip or 20-second clip. It's amazing how often there's more to the story. You can say, well, I saw it with my own eyes. Yeah, okay, well, let's look a little deeper. So imagine, we're used to doing that now with the video, perhaps, but when somebody sees a study with a certain finding, they just often just jump to a conclusion. Often isn't merited, but the natural impulse is to either trust the messenger or distrust the messenger. Say, oh, if he said it, it can't be true. And I think we just don't have the time or the incentive to investigate those kind of claims. So again, if you care about the truth, you should probably hold your judgment, just like you do on the baseball video. But most of us, we don't have such a big incentive to discover the truth. So we make a judgment one way or the other and move on.
Right. And then one way that we try to sort of get around these subjective reactions to things that we see online is we want to quantify it with data. I know that's another area that you've written extensively about. One of the things that kind of got me on this journey to questioning some of these assumptions was the article you wrote a while back, What Do Economists Actually Know?, which was refreshing because you're someone who presumably is supposed to be quantifying things and telling us what the truth is with these numbers and these mathematical models. And you were kind of questioning your own assumptions and the assumptions of your profession. And now on the internet, we have these sort of perpetual cycles of outrage where it can be very difficult to gauge sort of what's real and what's just manufactured. And, so we can say, well, we can look at a school shooting or police violence, or we can even look at people on college campuses that are supposedly shutting down free speech. And on social media now, basically, one incident or a couple of incidents is proof of some, overarching social trend. And for some social phenomena, it can be really difficult to collect reliable data that are reflective of trends that really do warrant concrete political action. So, but, on the flip side, some even isolated incidents can reveal systemic flaws that do warrant political action. So in this age of, overwhelmingly abundant data and information, how can we make reasonable inferences about what's a truly meaningful trend without succumbing to and perpetuating this crisis of the day online?
It's really hard. I'm always amazed how often when I look a little deeper, it's more complicated than I would have thought. I'll just take one example. Maybe we can talk about others, but maternal mortality is rising in the United States, the death of women in childbirth. And that's perplexing. It's disturbing. It's just horrible, right? How could it be that in one of the richest countries in human history, it's becoming more likely that a woman dies giving birth? And so when you read that, that's a fact, by the way. I should be careful how I use the word fact. It's a piece of data. If you look it up, if you Google maternal mortality trends or maternal mortality 2019 or maternal mortality 2015, and you'll pull up either websites or charts that try to measure this, and you'll see that it's rising. And that seems like a fact. It's not a fact, though. It's not a fact like a truth. And it starts raising the question: what does that mean, a fact? Don't we all agree on what a fact is? And the answer is not exactly. So if you look into that, you'll discover that over the course of the last 20 years, different states have changed how they report maternal mortality. So they didn't all change at the same time, but and not all of them changed. But over a period of the last 15 or 20 years, states changed how they reported that number. And just for starters, it measures. I'm going to be careful here. I might get it wrong. So don't trust this. You might want to verify it also. I think it's within if a woman died within a year of giving birth. So for starters, when I hear maternal mortality, to me that means you died in the hospital or at home or in the birth process. But that's not what it means. It's not the way the data are gathered. And then there's the problem of when someone dies a certain number of months after giving birth, is it because of the childbirth or is it because of something else? And so all of a sudden you realize, and you also discover that, so what that means, by the way, is that until this data change, there were women dying in childbirth, say 6 months after giving birth, who weren't called to death in childbirth, but now are called to death. So that's going to cause a rise in that figure. Now, we could still have a big social problem. You could still debate and argue, and you could make the case that whatever the number is, it's too high. You could argue that not whatever it is, but at the current level, it's too high. But before you decide we have a crisis because it's rising, you want to make sure it's actually rising and what's being measured is being measured accurately. So that happens so many times. What will happen is that an activist who is trying to make progress on a particular issue, in this case, let's say hospital safety or the safety of mothers, is going to trumpet this number, this rise in the rate, because that's their business. That's what they're trying to do. And you can argue, well, that's a good thing because we don't want women to die in childbirth, and for sure we don't. But if we want to understand truth, we need to figure out what's causing the change that we're trying to reduce. And in this particular case, it's more complicated. It's just extraordinary how many things you'll read like that if you bother and say, I want to see, is that really true? And you look into it a little more, you find out it's more complicated. And even things you think, well, that one they can't have changed, they can't have messed that one up. But they often have, sometimes through just honest error. They want to believe something, and so they trumpet it as a problem. Or sometimes it's worse. Sometimes it's just dishonesty. A group is trying to advance an agenda, and they'll just fudge the numbers in a particular way. It's often a definite change in definition or a broadening of definition. And as you point out, I'll give you another example. The number of people who think socialism is great and capitalism is awful appears to be rising. But you have to really ask, what do people mean by those terms? And when they're answering the question, what do they mean by those terms? And so it's there are crises that get manufactured because the numbers are tricky.
Yeah, and the flip side of that is you also want to be respectful of things that do warrant attention. And but it's hard to say based on the data because the data is based on so many assumptions, many of which are flawed. The data is based on.
By the way,
yeah, sorry.
Everything merits attention. A lot of things merit attention. Right. Maternal mortality merits a lot of attention. So I don't want to ever suggest that, we don't need to worry about that because it's they changed the way the data is collected. So you always want to be careful. I'll give you another example. There was a study that showed that 40% of Americans can't afford an unexpected expense of $400. Whoa, boy, that's depressing. $400, not that much money. 40% of Americans can't afford an unexpected. Wow. And so I didn't look into this one carefully, but it appears that there was a question asked, how would you pay for an unexpected $400 expense? One of the choices was cash. One might have been debt. I didn't look at it carefully, but I wouldn't pay cash. I have no problems with an unexpected $400 expense, but I wouldn't pay cash. I don't have $400 in cash with me most of the time. I put it on my credit card if I had to pay $400 unexpectedly. Is that debt? Do I have to go into debt? Is that what that means? Well, in my case, it doesn't mean that. I guess it means that in some sense, because I don't pay my credit card right away. I wait until the end of the month. But I wouldn't really call that a crisis, right? That I have use a credit card to pay for an unexpected $400 expense. So when I tweeted that, responding to somebody who made this point about its credit card, and let's assume that's correct just for the point, they said, well, when you take that into account, it's actually only 12%. It's not 40. So when I retweeted that claim, people said, so 12% is okay? No, 12% is still a problem. The 12% of Americans struggle to pay a $400 unexpected expense is depressing. We'd hope that number could go down in the future. We'd wonder why there are 12% of Americans who struggle to make a $400 payment. But it's different from 40. And how much energy and time and resources we spend on this problem as opposed to the thousands of others does depend on how big it is, or it should, seems to me. So that's what's at stake here. It's not a question of do we want to make the world a better place. It's how do we do that effectively. And that's going to depend on, it depends on a lot of things, whether the trend's getting worse. It depends on what the level is of the variable that we're worried about. And also, of course, depends on our ability to do something about it, which is a whole other issue, and where that, what's the potential for improving matters. So all that is relevant.
Yeah, and the more you discuss this, the more you're just kind of like, you have to take a step back and realize how complex some of this stuff really is, because in a vacuum, it's very easy to say, be given a piece of data and say, well, this is a problem and it warrants all this extra attention. But that extra attention in the real world comes in the form of actual resources that have to be put into solving that problem. And then, as you talked about, it's this never-ending series of trade-offs. But when everything is a perpetual crisis, then it warrants continual attention and resources to the point that it's exhaustive, right? Like, where do we stop?
Yeah, who yells loudest gets the attention in that situation often. And so that's part of what the game is. Who can yell the loudest, get people most offended, most scared, I'll give you one more. Can I give you one more?
Sure.
That goes against my priors, and it's making me reconsider a view. So there's a standard view out there that America is being hollowed out as a manufacturing base, and I've always pointed out, many people on my sort of way of looking at the world have often pointed out as well, that well, it's kind of deceptive, this hollow out thing, because actually, although there's fewer workers in manufacturing and as a proportion of the total number of workers, and even though there were sometimes some years even absolutely fewer workers, not just as a proportion, but the total number has gone down, American manufacturing is thriving. And it's the employment that's gone down. The output's gone up. Well, it's gone up a lot. So we're not being hollowed out. We're being hollowed out in the sense that manufacturing as a source of employment is less important than it was before, but we still make stuff. So that's a common thing I've said many, many times, and I've been fairly confident about. Now, I have conceded occasionally that, yeah, measuring how much we manufacture is tricky because, yeah, how do you add up airplanes and machines and computers and toys and et cetera? You've got a big pile of all those things, and some of them in any one year are going to go down, but others are going to go up, and you don't want to look at any one category. You want to look at our entire manufacturing base. So you have what's called an aggregation problem or an index number problem, a composition issue. And so you're going to have to make some simplifying assumptions, and typically what people do is they look at either value or value added, and so they're trying to use dollars as the measure of manufacturing. So just to simplify it, what you want to do is you want to see if the pile of stuff got bigger, but you don't want to just that we manufacture. But when you say bigger, obviously you don't just mean airplanes because they're physically big versus, say, semiconductors because they're small. Bigger means bigger in some significant way. So we typically would look at, say, dollar value. So when you do that, you see that manufacturing has gone up a lot. And we're not being hollowed out. We're not becoming a country where we just do each other's laundry for each other, which is the sort of extreme parody of the worriers and doomsdayers about Americans' manufacturing base. So I've always thought that was the right view, that we're actually producing a lot more. But I recently saw a paper, which I had not seen. It came out a while ago, but I missed it, suggesting that actually almost all the gains in manufacturing output are being driven by one sector, which is computers. That when you look at everything else, it's not going up, it's going down. And that's just an example of just how complicated stuff is, that when you look more closely, you often are going to have to reevaluate what you think is so obviously true because you've seen the facts, or you've seen the data, or you know that this is the case. And I haven't made up my mind yet on this. I need to read the paper more carefully, and I'm going to interview the author for my podcast. But it's just an example, again, of how complicated things are and how easy it is to use something that looks like a fact that is actually a little more complicated when you look a little more closely.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about activism earlier on, and I feel like now that the line between media creation and media consumption has been blurred, so that pretty much anybody with a Twitter follower with a Twitter profile and a lot of followers is sort of de facto an expert. So there's been this kind of blurring and this questioning over what truly constitutes expertise. And on the one hand, I kind of like the idea that people who aren't specialists in a particular profession can question the quote unquote experts, because I don't think that knowledge is really should be monopolized by particular professions, right? Like no matter what profession you're in, you should be able to justify what you're doing and your beliefs to even people outside of your field. But on the other hand, there are certain situations that do warrant a level of expertise, and I think a level of deference from people who aren't in that field. And one example was, I remember there was that viral hashtag campaign a couple of years ago, the Bring Back Our Girls, the girls who were held hostage by Boko Haram in Nigeria. And my group in the military, when I was in the military, participated in search and rescue missions. And even for the experts, like these missions are so sensitive and dynamic, but now you have literally anybody with a Twitter profile is effectively a hostage negotiator. And like I said, I like the idea that like a non-economist can challenge an economist about economic theory. I think that kind of scrutiny is warranted, but there are also situations where I think we need to respect expertise. So how do you kind of navigate that line where everyone's kind of an expert and an authority figure now based on just their platform and their social media following.
Yeah, there's no simple answer to that, right? I'm a big fan of certain kinds of expertise and other kinds of expertise I'm extremely skeptical of. And you might make a different list from mine. I'm sure you would, as to what you respect and what you think we should be skeptical about. In that particular case of Bring the Girls Home, that's a case where there was an unintended consequence due to somebody trying to do a good deed. But usually it's something a little more sinister than that. I always think about the American Association, or I think it's the American Society of Engineers, gives an annual report card for America's infrastructure, and we usually get a bad grade. It's usually like a D. And that's not surprising that the American Society of Engineers would want people to think that we need to improve our infrastructure. Now, it may turn out our infrastructure is not very good, or maybe we really do need to spend a lot more on it. But you'd want to take the American Society of Engineers recommendation with a grain of salt. You'd want to be a little bit skeptical about it, even though they would know a lot more than you or I would know about whether a bridge is safe, or whether a crack in a bridge is something to be alarmed about. So you'd want to respect their expertise, but you'd also want to remember that they kind of have a stake in the game and they have a stake in the matter. So they're not really an objective observer. So that balance is inherently tricky.
Yeah. And I mean, another kind of really difficult question here, because some of these are unanswerable, but I think the idea is just to show that we can't be certain of ourselves. Yeah. But and so another one, and kind of like a timeless debate here, is there's this idea now that these various tech platforms perpetuate existing social and economic inequalities. So to be clear, these are inequalities that existed well before the advent of these tech platforms. And the idea, and I could be wrong here, but presumably some of these algorithms recognize demographic patterns to customize advertisements. And these platforms, as far as I know, aren't seeking to create inequalities, but they exploit existing economic distributions, which often correlate with ethnic stratification, to help advertisers sell their products. So it's one of these questions where it's easy to demonize these tech platforms, but they're basically just reacting to the incentives. So do you think that the burden is on some of these tech platforms to kind of not exploit some of these market opportunities, or do you think maybe we should ask a more systemic question and try to change the incentives? Because to me, it's kind of naive to expect some of these tech platforms to not take advantage of an economic opportunity when the incentives are asking them to. But at the same time, you could make an ethical, a non-economic case that if these tech platforms were sort of truly ethical, that they would not be exploiting these opportunities.
Yeah, that's a hard one. I don't really want the tech platforms trying to decide what the right level of inequality is in the world, or trying to fight against it. Or it's like, I have 4 children. I read to all of them every night before they went to bed from a very young age until they were pretty old, like 8. I don't know how old, maybe older sometimes, every night. And I've actually read, not often, but I have read an article that says, that's immoral on my part because that gives them a leg up. And since I'm already above the average in income, I should, I guess I'm supposed to help my kids be less successful. I don't know. That just strikes me as an evil attitude, actually, not even a questionable one, just evil, to encourage people to not help their children. So that's a natural human impulse to want your children to be successful, happy, ideally moral people. And I think reading to your kids is what everybody should do. And if there are people who are starting out ahead of other people and we want to help them, I don't think the way to do that is to hurt the ones who are already ahead. I do think we ought to make it harder for people who are ahead to exploit us illegally or immorally, but I don't think reading to your kids is one of those things. But my more general point is I don't really want tech companies to get in the business of trying to figure out what the right thing to do is like that, and we ought to try to solve those problems through other dimensions. Having said that, I do think there's some morality issues around the tech business, and I do think that it's we're going to face some challenges there over the next few years, trying to figure out what to expect of them versus what we should force them to do. That's going to be a big area that a lot of people are going to be writing and talking and legislating about.
Yeah, and some of these issues with the tech platforms, like you can address them on the micro and the macro level, and one of those issues is this idea of data mining. So on a micro level, data mining or collecting this data in the aggregate doesn't seem to be overly problematic, because if you're just collecting one person's data, how powerful is that? And I look at it like, on the micro level, regardless of my internet activity, I get to ultimately decide whether to click on an advertiser's link or a politically inflammatory headline. Like, I can make that decision. But data mining is not a micro level phenomenon, right? Because you're collecting all this data through various platforms, and the data in the aggregate has far-reaching social and political effects. So on the one hand, these algorithms reflect what we really want, because they're catering to our political beliefs and our emotions and all these things, and they're collecting all this data, synthesizing it, and they're spitting us back whatever it is that we in the aggregate want, or even as individuals. And if we're really appalled by what we encounter online, you can make the argument that we just shouldn't click on some of these articles that are really just a reflection of us. So you could make the case that maybe it's not the tech platform that's the problem, it's really we're the problem. But where it becomes problematic is when you have these huge stores of data that basically serve as almost irrefutable power. And the more data some of these tech platforms collect, the more difficult it is for other tech platforms to compete and maybe have a more ethical platform that isn't based on collecting all this data without people's informed consent. So how do you kind of navigate this micro versus macro level analysis as it pertains to data mining?
Yeah, I think it's a little worse than you said, actually. You're 90% of the way there. It's not just that you get more competition. Excuse me, let me restate it. It's not just that they collect a lot of data and that makes it harder for other people to compete with them and be more ethical about how they collect data. It's that it allows them to have less competition, which allows them to potentially change the political outcomes that we have, because they can steer political knowledge and steer what we have access to for just our general level of information. So that's what I'm most worried about. As you say, if somebody sends me an ad for something that I don't really want to see, at least I don't have to buy it. I don't have to, even if I click it through, I don't have to buy it. And if I do buy it, you could argue, well, that was good for me. And I think a lot of people like the tailoring of ads based on their information. They think that's a feature, not a bug. And I make the joke all the time. It's kind of cool that Google knows where I am, because they can tell me where I might want to go or what I need to use to, say, get home from the airport, because they know I'm at the airport, and they know I have a trip that day because they saw the email confirming the flight. So you could argue that most of that's kind of cool. Most of us like that, but it's a lot scarier, I think, when we talk about political outcomes. And for me, when I've been thinking about it lately, I use the example of my washing machine breaks. I call a repairman, and he comes to my house, and so at one level he might, while he's in my house, notice that I have a certain set of things on the walls, and I have certain kind of books, and I have a certain style of say, dishes, and he could make a lot of observations about me while he walks through my house. And in theory, he could tell somebody what was in my house and say, I was at this guy's house and his dishes look kind of old. Maybe you want to sell him some new dishes, and I get an ad for dishes in the mail. And I might realize, I wonder if that washing machine repairman told somebody about this. That's why I got this ad. And you'd say, oh, that's not a big deal. I throw the ad out, or maybe I'd be glad. But now suppose he doesn't just tell somebody. He starts taking pictures while he's in my house. I say, what are you doing? Oh, I sell this to people. They'll pay me for this because they want to sell you stuff. Now, how many of us would go, oh, okay, I get it. That's fine. You'd say, what, are you out of your mind? But that's that's almost exactly what Google and Amazon and Facebook has done. They figured out aspects of our lives that we've revealed, not with intent, but by giving them access to our house for one reason. Oh, I get to share pictures with my friends. of my vacation. Now they're using that to figure out where I was on vacation, where I might want to go next year, and a million other things about me. And that's really peculiar. And then it goes the next level, which is the washing machine repairman comes into my house. He says, while I'm here, I'm going to take a lot of pictures, but the other thing I'm going to do, I'm going to give you a free washing machine. Really? Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I'm not going to repair this. I'm just going to give you a new one. Thanks a lot. But I am going to figure out, based on the washing machine, what kind of clothes you wear and how worn out they are. And sometimes you're going to get ads for clothes. Now, that might be great. I might be okay with that. I might not be okay with that. But if I don't realize that's happening, it's a little creepy, right? So suppose they don't tell me. And then maybe at the end of a year, I get a little thing in the mail that says, if you don't want us to keep track of your clothes, just check this box. And then I don't notice the ad. I don't notice the mailing. I don't just the whole thing is just a different kind of access to me that most of us are not prepared to think about. And it's just happened. And as a result, there's a lot more knowledge about me. It's one thing to say, oh, yeah, I don't like it because Google's making money off of me. It's not just that they're making money off of me. They're making money off me in a particular way. They're revealing things about me that I wasn't aware that they were revealing. That's the first part. The second part is it's not just about my dishes and my clothes. They know a lot about perhaps what kind of politics I have and what kind of partisanship I have and who I think is great and who I don't. And people can buy that information, influence my vote. And then all of a sudden, your choice about letting Google in your house is affecting which person gets elected president. That seems like not so good for democracy to me. So then the question is, what do you do about it? Do you regulate them? Do you change the contract? Do you make certain kinds of contracts illegal? Those are the issues I think we're going to be grappling with over the next few years.
Well, yeah, there's a lot there to digest. And so that's kind of where I wanted to go now is what do we actually do about this stuff? I think that you kind of touched on the privacy aspect of things where, to me, and I would encourage you to challenge me here, even if you could consent to this type of thing happening, I don't think you should be able to consent your right to privacy away. So, for example, I look at some of these search engines and social media platforms as kind of an extension of my thoughts, and I don't necessarily want my brain being broadcasted out to other people and having that data and those ideas being collected and potentially monetized. It's not that there's criminal or deviant thoughts going on in my head, but there are certain things that are private that I would just choose not to share with people that aren't in my immediate circle of friends and family, right?
But now, Doug, I'm going to give you a free washing machine.
Right. But so that's the thing is...
Don't you want to give me access now?
Yeah, and I think there are certain people who are like, well, I've got nothing to hide, but like you, I'm kind of much more of a bottom-up emergent order type person. I don't like top-down paternalism. I don't like people telling us what we should and shouldn't do, but there are certain things that I think are kind of non-negotiable, and privacy is probably one of them. So as far as if we were to legislate some of this stuff, like what sort of combination of regulation, competition, and transparency do you think is needed to maximize the convenience offered by these platforms without the privacy intrusions and some of the potential for exploitation, whether it's politically or from some of these nefarious parties?
Well, I think we've looked at it the wrong way so far, mostly in economics, at least. A lot of people look at it through antitrust, meaning, oh, well, Google's got a monopoly or near monopoly on the search engine, so therefore we should break them up or restrict them in certain ways. And that argument isn't so useful because, first of all, I use DuckDuckGo. I don't use Google for my searches, and there are viable choices. You could argue that they just have a large market share. It's certainly not a real monopoly, not one seller. But you can still argue, but they have a big market share, and that's not healthy. But I think that's wrong. Not wrong. It's not the right way to think about it, because when you think about it that way, it's like, okay, so what's the harm to me from their lack of competition? And I think most people's reaction is, yeah, well, it's still free, so why should I care? And the answer is not free. It looks free, but it's not. The costs are being generated by the advertisers, the people who are buying the information. I'm paying higher prices elsewhere. I just don't see the connection. That's problem number one. Problem number two is I think of it more as I think there's a better way to think about it, which is as a property rights problem. It's what the example I gave before. Yeah, nobody can come in my house when I'm not there. Let's take that. Forget the fact that my washing machine's broken. Let's just say they just want to come to my house and start taking photographs and sending them out to advertisers and charging people for them, not giving me any of the money and raising the costs of the people who are selling me stuff to get access to my photos of my house. You say, well, you don't have any right to do that. So it's a little weird that we have just conceded implicitly the right of Google and other online platforms to just take this information and sell it. So who's it belong to? Well, they've de facto just grabbed it. And we could change that. I'm not sure it's a good idea to change it. I'm not sure we should be charging them or they should have to pay me or per click or whatever it is. But right now, I don't think the feedback loops of the things that usually make bottom-up stuff work well, they're not really there. You could argue, well, if people really were bothered by it, there'd be a new search engine that would do better. There would be a new social media platform, and there's a lot of changes going on. By the way, right? There are people who got very upset by the Cambridge Analytica problem with Facebook recently and decided to stop using the platform. So you could argue that the natural forces that generate bottom-up solutions are in play, but I just don't know if they're big enough. And I'm not going to say, therefore, we need to regulate. I'm not ready to do that yet or say that. But I do think it's a slightly unusual situation due to the fact that the property rights are not well defined. And that's as to who owns my information. It seems like the default should be that I own it. The fact that they're selling it without my real understanding of that strikes me as not a good situation. And what we should do about it, that's a little more tricky.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I just don't necessarily know if a purely bottom-up solution is going to keep some of these companies in check. And maybe this is me being overly cynical, but this data is so powerful and both sides of the political aisle want this data that I don't necessarily see either side cracking down and trying to regulate these companies, because these companies can really play both sides of the fence. I mean, are you hopeful at all that if indeed top-down type of initiatives were needed, that it's actually possible, just considering how much power these companies actually have politically even?
Yeah, I don't know. I agree with you, though. I think a lot of incentives to kind of leave it the way it is. It'll be really interesting to see how it plays out. I don't have any insight into what's likely to happen, though, but it's going to be complicated by what you just said, that political actors like to use this information too. So it's a little bit tricky, really tricky, actually.
Yeah. I mean, I know that you host a podcast for a living as well. So, I mean, any parting shots or things that you'd like to leave us with that I haven't thought of? I mean, are you hopeful that this whole tribalism and technological cycle can be curtailed? Are you optimistic, or do you think that it's something that we're going to have a more catastrophic type outcome before behavior is actually changed?
That's a tough one. I don't. I'm not so optimistic. I'm not as optimistic as I was 5-10 years ago, for sure. Tribalism is deep in the human psyche. We like to belong to things, and partisanship is one way we express it. So I'm not convinced we're going to get less tribal in terms of political partisanship over the next decade. So, and the technology seems to be enhancing that ability to indulge it, what we talked about in the beginning of our conversation. So, and to bring us full circle, it's not obvious that there's a kind of regulation that's going to quote, fix that. It's more likely to lead to other consequences that we might not like or might be complicating things. So one way to be optimistic is to say, well, we'll develop some cultural responses and norms. If you walk around a party these days, or you walk around any kind of place where there's people, you see a lot of people riveted to their phones. Is that a good thing? Bad thing? I don't know. It's a new thing. It's certainly a relatively new thing that people in social situations ignore the people around them and look at their phone. So let's say we decided that's really not healthy for human beings. Should we do something about it? And I don't want the government doing anything about it. I rather would rely on the fact that if it's really that unhealthy for us, we will probably see some cultural forces and norms that encourage people to put their phones down. We already see some signs of that. It's not big, but it's happening. So I'm always hopeful that solutions can emerge that aren't anyone's plan. And culture is one way that happens, and we'll see if that can help us. But we got a lot of challenges ahead of us.
Yeah, I know we're coming up on time here. Last time I spoke with you, you had just written "How Can Adam Smith Change Your Life?" What do you have in the works now? Writing any books? Any particular projects? Things of interest?
Well, I've been working on a series of videos on how easy it is to misinterpret numbers related to standard of living and the state of the middle class. So I'm still working on that. Put out 3 videos on that. They're about 8 minutes each, and I got a 4th one coming out soon and a 5th one in the works. So that's one project I'm on doing. The other is for a book. I'm hoping to write a book on what we've been talking about today, how our brains and opinions get formed through the consumption and looking at numbers and data, and how challenging that is for us. So that's what I've been thinking about lately.
All right, and I mean this in the most complimentary way. If you want to be less sure of yourself, just listen to Econ Talk.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for your time, Russ, and look forward to chatting again soon.
You bet. Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by Resilient Performance Systems. If you enjoy the material here, please check out our website at www.resilientperformance.com and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on future podcast episodes, articles, and upcoming content, including training templates and live and online courses. The sign-up link for the newsletter is in the show notes. Podcast listeners will receive a discount on all paid content by entering the coupon code PODCAST. That's PODCAST in all capital letters. Additionally, please consider writing an iTunes review if you find these podcast conversations informative. They help us continue to attract high-quality guests.